In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
All right, welcome, Sublation Media viewers. It's I, Douglas Lain, the king of Sublation Media, and you can't do anything about that. With me today is Benjamin Studebaker.
Yes, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker, PhD in Politics and International Studies from the University of Cambridge, and the author of two books, Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
Benjamin, I spent this morning reading Adorno's On Jazz in preparation for this stream. I thought that the work was not racist, worthwhile, still applicable, not just applicable to jazz, but applicable to our society perhaps as a whole, because by using jazz as an example, it creates Adorno sketched out a picture of how mass culture operates and creates conformity. And I thought we would take it up today as a way to think about the protests that have been dominating the news in Los Angeles and, across the country, apparently, the No Kings protests. But to begin with, as is my want, I want to play a little music to bring in this No Kings jazz moment. So here it is. It's the Tiger Rag from 1918. Let's see. All right, that's enough of that. That was just a taste of the kind of jazz that Adorno was criticizing, along with many other forms of jazz. And what I will say about his critique is, first of all, the fact that he has critiqued jazz as a form of cultural oppression, really, does not mean that we cannot enjoy the music or that we have to denigrate the musicians who were put through the process of creating mass culture. It doesn't mean that we should, take our enjoyment to be a final judgment either, but it doesn't mean we have to dismiss the entire form or not listen to it. But have you read On Jazz? Benjamin?
Yeah. I'm not so up on the music theory as some people would be. So when he goes into great depth about the actual construction of the music, a lot of that goes over my head because I am not baked in music theory. But what sticks out is that it's an argument about an increase in conformity in the kind of music that can be played. There's often a claim that a jazz musician is engaging in an individualistic act when that act actually does follow a relatively narrow range of conformist patterns in which the individuality can be expressed. There are kind of tracks available to the jazz musician who is improvising that the jazz musician can choose among, but ultimately they can't really break the form or deviate very heavily from its fundamental structure, which is, oriented around dance music, which is performing a certain kind of function in society. It may be pleasant, it may be fun to dance to it, But of course, if you think about what is the function of the nightclub that you go and dance in at the end of the workday or at the end of the work week, of course it has a function in capitalism. And of course, the music that's played in such a setting has a function. And this is something that a lot of people could recognize at later stages when it's more obvious or overt, or to do with pop music or to do with disco. A lot of people hated disco, the same reasons that Adorno hated jazz, I think, at a fundamental level. Although when we get into music theory, then there's specificity and detail to this that I'm not a master of.
Yeah, when I was reading it, I had to remind myself what syncopation was, for example, right? It's when you're like if the beat is 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, you would actually, syncopation would be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So it's off. It's the in between. What Adorno is noting is that syncopation is not actually disruptive, or doesn't lead the beat away into another rhythm, but confirms it, reaffirms it, returns to it. So that's just one example. Now, someone says maybe Adorno was a racist. And I would say, maybe. You know what? I don't know. I never met Adorno. But I can say that if you read On Jazz, there's no evidence of racism in the essay that I saw. Do you think that that's fair? Or how would you read On Jazz in terms of his racism?
For some people, there is no there to aesthetics. For people for whom aesthetics is just a matter of taste, there can't be any kind of real reason to dislike a genre of music apart from disliking the people who play it or enjoy it. And so for some people, there's not really an interest in having a discussion of aesthetic theory, because for them, it's all just a gustibus donus disputandum, and there's nothing to think about.
Right. Okay, so that just shows that the ability to think about art has been crushed, maybe, amongst certain portions of the population.
And that, one of the ways in which all of this is rationalized is by saying anyone who is objecting to it is upholding a kind of conservative, curmudgeonly standard that comes from pre-modernity, pre-capitalism, that prevents people from having fun. Right, part of the narrative of 18th century theory is that luxury, stuff that was previously considered bad for you, might actually be good for you because it contributes to the economy. And what we used to think of as virtue can perhaps potentially be thrown out. If you apply that kind of thinking to the arts, then old artistic standards might just be framed as gatekeeping from a prior era and chucked.
Right. Although, I mean, even today, if you are to become a musician at all, generally speaking, you will study musical forms. And if you don't, if you're like a pop artist that practices sort of his music or her music as a pseudo amateur, you'll nonetheless have spent enough time listening to and practicing music on that basis through repetition and copying to have developed skills and an ear that is not merely thoughtless. You'll
to be able to execute the conformist standards of pop music, you still do have to understand music on some level. You have to have an instrumental understanding. You have to be able to execute something that is already given to you by the music market and what is competitive and saleable within the music market. What you lose is the ability to make your own decisions about what to play, to be able to construct and invent something distinctive. That you're not able to do. And yet it's claimed that you can do that. You're constantly told that you can go and start a band, start a jazz band, start a rock band, especially back in the middle of the 20th century, in your basement with your friends, and have a new sound that comes from you and your situation, your experience. But none of that is actually true, because what's actually saleable in the market is very limited.
Right. And now today it's even more the case that people are told that they can create their own music and choose what to perform, what to compose. And they have all sorts of technical instruments available to them for free or near very, very low cost to facilitate the creation of music. But it does strike me, and I'm not that educated in musical theory really at all, but listened to it quite a lot. I used to work for the Oregon Symphony, and I developed a kind of instrumental understanding of music. I would say just that, because I never sat down and read deeply on the history of classical music or spent time actually attempting to consciously learn about it, but I would go to concerts and I learn that way. In any case, it does seem to me that the music that I hear, especially like something like dubstep or I'm always 20 years behind maybe, but it is repetitive and sounds quite alike, one piece to another. There's a sense of sameness across the field, even amongst people who are obscure, operating independently, and apparently not constrained by market forces.
Yeah, there's a repeated tendency for people to run up against the limits of these genres. These genres are marketized to death and become very stultifying. So then people attempt to rebel by going and starting new genres or breaking into new seemingly new spaces. But then all of the same market forces eventually have their way with those new genres, and all of the same dynamics are replicated. So jazz is disrupted by rock then becomes like jazz, and then rock is disrupted by rap, and rap then becomes like jazz. And people who still like jazz sound almost like people who still like classical music, because they're holding on to something which seems more rigid relative to what's new. But what's new is actually not very different from jazz, in the sense that rap is, you have the ability to say whatever, be creative in your rhyming and your battle rapping and so on. But ultimately, in terms of the music and in terms of what's competitive, over time, it narrows and narrows and becomes increasingly the same. And so each of these attempts to have a possibility of innovation or individuality consistent with capitalism is eventually revealed to be false.
Yeah, and you don't have to work very hard to recognize that classical music is far less rigid than contemporary popular music. It just
isn't that an interesting paradox? It becomes much more open to different kinds of sound, even though it seems to have all of these rules.
Right. Yeah.
It's almost as if the rules create space for actual variation and differentiation.
The other thing is there are rules for pop music, but they're transmitted to if you're a punk musician, say, meaning you just started in your garage, you're gonna incorporate those rules into your work without examining them or seeing beyond them. Whereas there are more rules, but also through the you have very rigid rules in pop music.
Well, there's also what's the point of the rules, right? So the point of the rules in pop music is that it's been found through social scientific study that if you employ different kinds of specific sound patterns, then you make something that is more saleable on the radio. So it's been discovered through a process of instrumentalizing music for the purposes of making money and wringing consumption value out of it, that certain kinds of musical patterns are effective from the point of view of making saleable records. When classical music was being made, it was not being made with that purpose in mind. Classical music was in part something that you were supposed to be trained to appreciate, and that you wouldn't necessarily appreciate very much initially Certainly you wouldn't appreciate it with the same fullness that you could appreciate it with if you were educated. This idea that you have to be educated to properly appreciate art becomes counterproductive in an era where you're trying to make as much money as quickly as possible. In that era, you just cater to the initial musical impulses of the population without any regard for educating them in music. And we see this in the criticism of Adorno, which mostly takes the form of he's racist because he doesn't like this genre, and doesn't engage with music as something that you might need to be educated about.
Right. Now, the other thing I would want to point out is that it's not a matter of it simply being the case that, in a pre-capitalist or pre-modern world, there was a hierarchical system of elite education, which could produce the finest works of art. That is true. But it is also, I think, the case that even on the level of folk music, there was more openness and variety, even if that music developed much more slowly, and did have a tendency to become traditional and be passed down in a rather rigid form, perhaps. Nonetheless, there was more experimentation even amongst folk musicians. And so it's not a matter of the people who and their station determining the level of complexity or freedom in the work of art. There's coming from the totality of economic and cultural.
Even the folk musician is educated by playing the music in community with people for the purposes of generating a positive community. Making music to be sold, making music that's going to sell records, that is not the same thing as making music so as to make everybody in the village have a nice time. And if you notice, if you go to a nightclub, the music that is played is not music that would make everybody in a village or in a community have a nice experience. The music that's played in churches is closer to that. But the music that's played in nightclubs is played for a very specific demographic to give a very specific, very visceral experience that is pleasing to a specific slice of the population that buys and pays for music in very large numbers.
Side note: now I don't go to clubs, right? But I do occasionally go to bars, and I go, out into the world, these different places, cafes, restaurants, airports, and what I've noticed is that the music that is played is often very familiar to me as a 54-year-old Gen Xer, that I will hear Madonna or I'll hear some 80s hit again and again and again. And
nobody can play medieval folk music. So what you instead get is nostalgia. You get the music that might have been played when you were out dancing 30, 40 years ago.
30, 35, let's say. So that's, but I always feel somewhat like confirmed and happy to hear the music, and then at the same time bewildered, because you're talking, like, if I think about my own experience when I was 18, I would not have expected to be listening to Frank Sinatra or Doris Day when I went to a bar. Right. And if I was maybe later in the 90s, there was a period where that kind of came back. There was a swing resurgence. But overall, that was a very specific move when people did that. It wasn't ubiquitous. And now this is just ubiquitous. Is looking back to a time where the young people who were there, they were not alive, and they were not even a glimmer in their parents' eyes when this music was being performed originally, right? So
millennial hipsters did a certain amount of electro swing in the 10s.
Oh yeah. But but that was not ubiquitous across all, Gen Xers would return to swing music. There was the Squirrel Nut Zippers had a hit, right? And there were bars that were dedicated to that, but they were specific kinds of genre bars. They were not, you wouldn't walk in just anywhere and expect to hear that wall to wall. Is my point. Anyhow, putting that aside, so what I guess I'll just say is it seems that not only is mass cultural music conformist and limiting our ability to experience the aesthetic of freedom, but also it appears to not be able to innovate even on its own terms very easily anymore. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, but to move now from Adorno, and I would just recommend that people read the essay. If they think that Adorno is racist, read the essay and be careful on how you read it, because as some people have pointed out in the chat, to one of the moves that Adorno makes is to question and even dismantle and dispel the notion that jazz is a particularly black form of music that really can trace its roots to an African culture. It is, from Adorno's perspective, modern music produced under the forms of industrial capitalism and should be understood that way. Which doesn't mean that it wasn't produced by black people, but to be black in industrial society and the form of capitalism in especially in the United States, but really anywhere, means you are no longer part of some traditional culture. You're not.
We're not talking about Bantu folk music here. We're not talking about that.
Right. So let's talk about the protests now, because I feel as though, I almost as a rule of thumb now, when I look out into the world and I see mass protest marches, I can be fairly confident that they are going to lead the troops, the leftists, the young people, right back into the very conformist, limited capitalist politics that they apparently are attempting to rebel against and resist. And I would say that the No Kings protest is a particularly obvious example of this, just on the surface of it. But have you been following these protests?
Well, there was one Little No Kings protest in my hometown that, according to the Chicago Tribune, 226 people went to. Why the Chicago Tribune decided to deploy its finite resources to report on that Indiana No Kings protest, I don't fully understand. But certainly this is something that goes on in my neck of the woods.
Mm-hmm. And so what was the coverage like? What did you see when you took a look at that?
Well, you get quotes from various people about the things that they think Trump has done that they take to be illegal, or they don't agree with, don't approve of. It's really it's a protest against the administration. And because in the United States, the tendency is overwhelmingly to try to frame the president, if you don't like him, as a king. And this goes back hundreds of years. Mm. It's been repeatedly done over and over again. It's really just a way of protesting against the president.
Right. Now, was there mention of the unitary executive theory that's seemingly motivating Trump as he passes?
Not in the quotes from the ordinary people who are going. They'll make reference to things like he's picking people up off the street. Somebody said 90% of the things that he's done have been illegal, in my opinion. So it'll refer to specific things that he's done or is doing, taking health care away from people, things that people don't like that are taking place. Substantive, concrete things, not theoretical argument.
Right. But the framing around kingship, this No Kings approach, is motivated within the political elites within the Democratic Party by a rejection of, or an attempt to constrain a move to unify the executive, much more than it is about immigration or Medicaid.
I don't know, because I remember people used to do King George IV stuff with George W. Bush. People.
Yeah, but that was where the unitary executive theory really got started. I mean,
or Andrew Jackson, there's been a lot of this king stuff. If you don't like the president of the United States, it's really easy language to use to rally people against the president, whoever the president is, no matter what's going on. I don't think it's that deep for most of the people who go. The organizing group, insofar as there is a group that's doing the organizing, it's a bunch of numbers. Have you seen this group?
No.
50501, I think, is the sequence of numbers, but it's just a sequence of numbers. It's something that you couldn't even remember if you tried to remember it for any length of time. Wow. And this seems to be the way that they do it now. They want, it to appear as if there's no organizer. And insofar as there is an organizer, they want the organizer to be so uncharismatic, so unappealing, that you don't take any interest really in who the organizer is. Protests used to have trustworthy or seemingly trustworthy social associations and organizations in leading positions. So you would have the leading figures in churches, in labor unions, out in front. And so there would be a clear sense of who was leading and why you were following them. And now it's an NGO with a bunch of numbers for its name, with money coming from God knows where, with no particular person who is obviously the front person. And if you say, this is the person who's in front, they'll go, no, it's a leaderless movement. We're just one of the organizations that's part of something organic. They won't take any kind of organizational responsibility for the action.
Mm-hmm.
And they won't even try to lead it in any kind of real sense. And so anything that happens, they disavow if it goes badly in any way. One thing that it does seem distinctive about these guys is that they're very pro business and pro cop. So in the news reporting on the No Kings protest in my hometown, there was an emphasis on they thanked the police for coming and keeping them safe. In fact, the article led off with them reporting a counter demonstrator who came to argue with them to the police, which they did immediately. And then also they encouraged people who attended the event to shop at local businesses in the downtown.
Yeah. So what is the number that is behind this particular protest?
I think it's 50501, but the thing is it's a number, so I could easily have misremembered the number. I didn't type and look it up while talking to you on this particular occasion.
Okay, I'm looking at it right now.
Am I right?
And it's okay. Yeah, 50 protests, 50 states, one movement. So that's the basis for the number. That's a justification for it being a number. I guess that when you hear that, it might be easy to remember, to memorize that. 50 protests, 50 states, one movement. But it doesn't say.
Certainly that name has not been picked to optimize memorability or to invite you to think very much about the organization.
That is true. So it's political revolution, no voices unheard, build the resistance, and the voices of Florida that are listed as the coalition of different groups that are behind these protests that are putting this together. If I go to the first one, paulrev.com, it looks very similar to the other page. Lots of clip art, and it says transforming America through progressive politics. Critical June elections, make your voice heard. It's at the top. Let's see. Know about page. Listed at the top. There's a mission page. Paid for by the Political Revolution PAC. So it's a political action committee. That's the primary group that is putting this together. So
yeah,
and yeah. Well, a PAC, a political PAC, is a way for, like, I used to work for the Oregon State Public Interest Research Group, and what it would do is it was a lobbying organization aimed at the Democratic Party in the state of Oregon, and there was a national PIRG as well that would work on the federal level. And there were PIRGs in there, I think, every state. And what it would do is when there was an effort to put together a measure for a vote, a PAC would be formed and the same offices would be used and the same canvassers would be deployed as a part of the PAC. New literature would be printed up and we would go out and collect checks from the public in the name of the bottle bill or something that we were trying to get on the ballot. So a political action committee can be put together in support of a candidate. It can be put together in support of a measure. It's a way to create a shell organization to separate money from the main organization and to avoid campaign finance violations.
It generally makes it more obscure who's funding or supporting the action and makes it harder to track involvement. And that, I think, is a major issue with this new kind of activism. It's not designed. And when I say new, it's been going on for decades. It goes back 40, 50, 60 years. It's a kind of activism that doesn't really involve social organizations, that's meant to be able to persist in the absence of any kind of meaningful social organization, and which works on the basis of the way that the action is taken up in the media. So it aims to generate enthusiasm for the action through the television or internet news coverage, not on the basis that there's some local leader in your community who is associated with it that you trust, that you've been having a relationship with for a long period of time.
Yeah, and just to clarify that a little bit more, when you talk about social organizations, what you I think you mean is like local civil society organizations where people have come together regularly. Maybe you go through a church or a community center or something like that. Whereas with something like the PIRGs, that was built on the back of Ralph Nader's advocacy and his ability to bring together a variety of interests and big money people to then create a corporation, basically, to continue to do lobbying and advocacy work along the, in the name of consumer rights, after his push to put seatbelts in cars. So it was based on a single issue originally that, essentially I'm just a broad sketch of the Nader movement, but a single issue, a particular figure, a charismatic political figure, and not a party, but an organization that was built on the basis of not affinity exactly, but ideology and political aim. So you could have a variety of players from around the country, even around the world, who wanted to see certain things accomplished, and they would fund these efforts, which would then, hire people locally to do certain kinds of work, mostly canvassing and phone banking and things like that, getting petitions signed.
So a lot of the action is on the basis of employment. So it's on the action on the basis that there's a large pot of money that you can get access to if you do the kinds of things that the organization wants.
Right.
And that's the increasing mode through which everything happens. There's some large pot of money and you can get access to it if you bring yourself into conformity with the purposes of whoever has the money. A lot of academic research now works this way. Whereas before it was, on the basis of relationships. You trust, you are a part of an organization which has benefited you, which has positively contributed to your life. So in your downtime, when you're not at work, you are volunteering, you are contributing your time to the organization because it has benefited you in some way. You're not working for the organization. So you have these full-time activists, full-time NGO employees who are continuously on the payroll of different organizations. You are not involving ordinary working people who work outside of this space, except in cases where they contract out to some other kind of entity. but there's no, it's continuously done through work and through through work relations, through hiring people. It's never done through any kind of a non-corporatist social mode. So it works continuously through the corporatist managerial mode at every point.
Right, but it also takes on the form of something like a cult, because
corporations do.
Yeah, when I was working for the Pergs, one of the things they asked you to do right away was, after you were getting off work, to come out and socialize with everyone else on your team, and to go on retreats, and to basically make this job central to your life, and to create a milieu around it.
Yeah, this is what I think people are really, everybody on the left underappreciates the degree to which this is a problem. The corporation has stepped into the space that social associations used to operate in. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes people make it out like that there's no social associations anymore. There's an open space. People can create anything they want because there's a gap or a vacuum. But I do think that the corporation has inserted itself into this vacuum, and workplaces have taken on and appropriated elements of social associational life and integrated them so as to increase the dependence of the employees on the workplace, because now the workplace is not just your job, but it's also your social associational world. So the workplace becomes your church. And if you liquidate the labor union, the workplace even eats into what the labor union used to do, but does it through the corporatized HR system. Mm-hmm. So a consequence of this is that it becomes very difficult for people even to engage in any kind of social or political activity outside of something resembling a workplace forum. And so the norms of the workplace, of the corporate space, spread into every element of your life and consciousness.
Yeah, I that is true. But what I noticed is, when I left the nonprofit sector, especially, and particularly the political nonprofit sector, my work was less intrusive into my life, and the relationships I had with other employees was much more on the level of an acquaintance and just sort of politeness and cordiality, and not. I didn't make as many personal friends at work as I had when I was at Augsburg. It wasn't demanded of me that I have those sorts of relationships. It was liberating to move from.
About here?
Well, let's see. Just moving from political nonprofit work to art, working in nonprofits in the art world, meant that people were less likely to, have to socialize as a part of the job. Then when I worked for Comcast, during the training, there was an effort to get us to go and socialize a lot. But then once we were actually on the job, people just didn't. And it wasn't, it was much more, we were alienated from one another, and separated out and atomized more.
You weren't in an office setting in that job.
I was in an office setting in the symphony, but not. I was in a big warehouse in a call center at Comcast. So those would be the jobs that I would point to. But yeah, overall, I would say that the most intrusive, most cult-like was the political work, when you were actually, because the people who would do those kinds of jobs were younger. They were more, they required assistance basically in building a social life. They were, when you're 20, 21 years old and not in school, but working. There's more of a sense that you're kind of coming of age, and you need to create a social milieu for yourself and a network of support, especially if you're moving to a bigger city and things like that. So
You see that in the tech sector too. People come to Silicon Valley working for tech companies, and part of how that operates is through a very cultish kind of corporate space to make up for the limited social skills of the engineers who are young and inexperienced who come there.
Yeah, but the point for us just today, and as we refer to the No Kings movement, is to recognize that it is not organically arising. It's not being built on the disaffection of civil society on its own terms, but it is part of a long, ongoing process of capitalist politics, of the usual functioning of the everyday functioning of the capitalist apparatus. It's very much connected to party politics. It's a product of the Democratic Party, and the people who are involved with it are not free to direct it. It is not being directed from below. These are not.
They're employees.
They're for the most part, they're employees. But even those who are not employees are taking part in corporate events. So, like if you were to say, if I was at Osberg and we would organize an educational, let's say, some sort of educational event that everybody in a community would be invited to, they would be invited to come and look at our literature, perhaps give us money, sign a petition, and that's it. There would be no way for those people to get involved in rearranging the aims of the organization or questioning.
Because what that really is advertising. You're engaging in advertising. And the distinction between canvassing and advertising has collapsed.
I mean, it might be recruitment as well, in which case you would be
Lots of corporations set up their stalls at Purdue University and try to recruit the engineers there. But of course, once you sign up, once you take the 40 shillings off the drum for those who volunteer to come, then they'll have their way with you.
Right. I mean, the thing is, to say that it was advertising it was fundraising, right? Which is not merely about making your product known to the public so that they can then buy it, but because there was no product. Ultimately, the product was hidden away. The real product was happening in Salem, right? Or behind closed doors, as legislation was being drafted or rules were being drafted. So you weren't being asked to purchase a product which you would then use. You were being asked to contribute to a project which was operating without your input and was designed to do so. I mean,
and it's difficult because some social associations also do seem to have this character. One of the criticisms of many churches is that they can feel this way. You show up, they've got their thing that they're doing. You can join it if you want, but you can't really be a participant in it. You can't change it. You can't contribute to what's going on. And they'll use your volunteering energy if you've got a lot of it. But ultimately, your ability to affect the beliefs or the doctrine or what have you of the church is going to be limited based on the structure or the hierarchy of the church, which exists external to you. So sometimes, even in stuff that seems like a social association, these kinds of dynamics exist. But this is why I think it's really critical when we talk about this stuff to look closely at how these organizations are actually structured and whether the people who are participating in them are genuinely participating in a thick, meaningful sense.
Right. I agree. And I think that we should be extremely critical of these protest movements that pop up exactly on that basis, right? Precisely notice the way in which they are constructed to produce the same results again and again and again, and notice the ways in which they are the same more than focusing on the kind of inconsequential differences or flourishes or the syncopation or what have you. While we're talking, it does. I could not but think about Sublation itself and the fact that we are an LLC. The Sublation is an LLC. I run these after parties, so people should go and join and donate to the cause on Patreon.
Where people who go to the after parties able to affect the direction of the organization, or are they?
Well, not in any formalized way, right? There's discussion, and I take it up and think about it, and then I respond to what's said. But I don't. There's no formal way to direct what is being done at Sublation.
Well, then you're the king, and this is your.
I said that council. At the beginning. Did I not say?
Right. These are the counselors, and you can throw them out if they displease you. Right.
Yes, I can. But what I think ought to happen around some of the projects is that, because I actually do want, particularly in the Expansive Realist Writers Workshop, I really do want that to be taken up and transformed by the participants themselves. As we come to the close of the first round of the workshop, but I don't want it to just completely go off on its own with the same name either. So it's an interesting dilemma. But I do feel as though it would be good to formalize some way for the participants to make some choices and to have some input and to take it up as their own.
To take it in the opposite direction, I do think that sometimes participation can be fetishized to the point at which an organization isn't able to achieve any objective or end. The structure of an organization has to have something to do with its end or purpose. And that won't necessarily mean an unlimited amount of equal participation, because then there's the possibility of devolving into a talking shop. And I think a lot of left organizations, which have tried to get out of the corporate hierarchy, have overreacted to that and produced kind of talking shop environments where it's not possible to act. Not accusing you or Sublation of this, just thinking with it.
No. That is a complaint that actually in our talking shop comes up quite a lot. Steve particularly will say we're just creating a talking shop. And we sometimes seem to be repeating. So it is worth considering, but say more.
Yeah, I think sometimes people start to fetishize structure in part because they have an awareness that there is a uniformity of structure that has made it difficult for people to engage in genuinely different activity. So they start looking for a change in the structure as evidence that some other kind of activity will be possible, without actually thinking through how does the structure that they have adopted actually enable the specific activity in question. There's no actual linkage. They're not connecting the cars in their train. They're going, look, the cars are arranged in a different way. Therefore, the train must go somewhere else. But if you've got tracks in front of you, you've got tracks in front of you. So that, I think, has become another different kind of problem that a lot of anarchist organizations, organizations that have tried very hard to get away from the corporate world, have fallen into. One of the things that is very difficult is that often one kind of mistake generates an opposite kind of mistake as people learn a too one-sided a lesson from the initial mistake that they observed. And a lot of people spend their whole lives bouncing back and forth between different mistakes, never finding any way of working through the specific situation they're in. I think because there's a lack of attentiveness to situations.
Why are we unable to attend to the situations that we create, Ben?
Well, I think there's a complexity problem that makes it harder. I think also because social organizations have degenerated, we don't have large numbers of people structured to try to understand what's going on. we don't even have small groups of people with an appropriate kind of structure for trying to understand what's going on. So there's a kind of atomizing. Everybody's off on their own trying to understand stuff. When people come together, they have different frameworks, different concepts for talking about stuff that comes from their own individual understandings. There's a limited ability to dialogue across all of these different ways of putting things. And people often are building their identity into the particular concepts that they have developed, acquired. So they're resistant to deviating from those concepts or being more flexible or being more open. So it becomes difficult to have any kind of sustained dialogue about the situation that could allow all of the participants to come to a better understanding than they could have individually on their own. And I think the tendency, therefore, is for this stuff to devolve into everybody's got their own words. Nobody really wants to talk anybody in anybody else's terms, and people just go their own ways and return to looking at it by themselves again.
Yeah, this is something that I think is a real danger, actually. And I see it first and foremost actually in myself, right? Because I will do a lot of work on my own, do my own thinking. Then I will bring the ideas, often, let's say in these after parties, to everybody else. And what I encounter, it to me, experiences a kind of a frustrating failure to meet me where I'm at and listen, but for everyone else, they experience it the same way, only in reverse. They've been off on their own, doing their own thinking, coming to their own conclusions. And the task is not just to synthesize, but to actually fully work out and maybe debate the thinking that's been going on, so that we can make decisions about this. When is someone's thought actually leading off to a dead end? When are we making mistakes, and when are we discovering even small incremental solutions? And
I think the atomization that happens, the way that people cope with it is to identify with the product of their atomization. So the way that they cope with it is to try to build a sense of self around the ways in which they are estranged and different from others, which makes it very difficult to then break out of that without making people experience acute psychological distress.
Right. So so I've been talking to the same people, not always the same people every time, but the same group of, let's say, 20, 25 people who come in and out of these different after parties. And I've come to think of, okay, I know what each person's position is and what they identify with as they come in. Like I kind of can predict ahead of time what kinds of things people are going to say. And I'm sure they all can predict, because if they watch what I say on any of the other streams, you're going to hear me say some of the same things again. So they can predict very easily. I've gotten slotted in as a Gen X former anarchist, hippy dippy artist type or whatever I am. That's how I imagine. That who knows, right? But the point is that, this fragmentation gets reproduced, and through identification, I think, in one another and in ourselves. Have you experienced this?
Yeah, I think you have to have a common knowledge object. If you don't have something that you're trying to understand together, then there's nothing that you can check what you're doing in relation to.
Right.
And I think
why the Expensive Realists workshop is, I think, the most successful thing we've got going, because we have a common object every week. We have an essay or a work of nonfiction or a short story, and then I try to return to the themes that we've already touched upon. So, but that's basically educational. But then there's also the work that gets submitted, and we all respond to each other's work. But that's a long project. You don't just do one workshop and produce a massive change in the thinking and the quality of the work that the people who participate in the workshop are going to produce. I can just say from my own experience, I went to a 6-week writer's workshop in 1995. I was not a significantly better writer at the other side of it, but I had been given some tools in order to develop with I could develop with those tools.
Yeah, the institutions that used to do this kind of stuff were, institutions you made lifelong commitments to, institutions that people stayed in for long periods of time. If you're in a labor union, there's certain shared interests that the people in the labor union have that they're trying to understand and advance together, and that gives some disciplining to their activity. But once you no longer have any notion of what it is that you're trying to do, or what you're trying to understand, monasteries, universities, lots of different kinds of organizations, departments, used to have some sense of what it was that they're trying to do. And then when you have methods wars and you have a bunch of outside money that people are trying to get, this breaks down that shared understanding. And you see this even in university departments where now mostly what academics do is stay out of each other's way and only talk to the other people, a handful of people around the world who are looking at what they're looking at. And they don't even have real relations often within their own departments to large numbers of other people, because what they're doing is so estranged from what the people in the offices nearby them are doing. And some universities, try to militate against this and try to construct departments that are more united around some particular way of approaching. But often that's viewed as a weakness because it's a lack of diversity, and it leaves the department vulnerable to becoming irrelevant if the field as a whole moves away from that approach.
Well, listen, we've talked for just about long enough. It's 56 minutes into the first stream. There is a after party for this where we can pick up these themes. I think this was very good conversation because it moved from the usual kind of surface level critique, the repetition of pointing out that the contemporary left is controlled by the Democrats and blah, blah, blah. I do think Adorno's on Jazz is worth reading again. Maybe we'll talk about it in the future in the Expansive Realist Writers Workshop, for instance. But what I want to talk about in the after party is actually, and this is inward looking, but where we should go as a group and to overcome some of the problems we raised in this stream. So people can join us. It can be a Zoom call. And thanks everyone for watching. You want to say something before we close out, Benjamin?
I'll just say I think that you and I have over the time that we've been doing this had a number of conversations that have been good, in part because you and I are sufficiently interested in some of the same things that we're able to get somewhere in our talks.
Right, and this was one of them. So I always appreciate that about you, Ben. And I'll see everybody on the other side. I'll be around 20 minutes from now when we start the Zoom call. So thanks, everybody.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people live